I'm Sarah from Old Design Designs. Thank you for joining me today on my knitting backwards tutorial. Now I'm producing this tutorial as part of the Yarndale at Home 2020 experience, because as 2020 is turning out to be such an unusual year, we're not meeting in person at the Yarndale Skipton auction market as usual, where I normally have a stand, and instead we're doing this from home. And one of the things we'd like to offer is some tutorials on some new techniques. The technique I'm going to be showing is knitting backwards, which is really useful if you're working in stocking stitch over a small number of stitches. So if you're working in entrelac, which is what this sweater, Stellara sweater, is worked as, then it is a really helpful technique to stop you having to turn a whole big garment backwards and forwards every time you need to change between knit and purl rows. Stellara is a top-down sweater and it's got an entrelac yoke. So let's get going. So entrelac knitting has become a new passion of mine, and I really enjoyed making these little blocks that I included in my Stellara sweater. However, whilst these are fairly straightforward to do, you just knit backwards and forwards. So in the base triangles you knit one, you purl that one, then you knit two, purl those two, knit three, purl three, knit four, purl four, and so on until you completed the triangle. Then move on to the next sets of stitches and do the same. And it's exactly the same with the blocks, and you're just knitting backwards and forwards, each time decreasing along this side one of the line stitches from the base triangle, and you knit backwards and forwards, knit and purl each row until you've decreased all these side stitches. Now that's really quite nice and pleasing, and it creates this really lovely sort of woven appearance where it looks like the knitting's going over and under each other. But the most difficult or tedious part of it is the constant changing from knitting a stitch to purling a stitch, knitting two stitches, turning around, purling two stitches. And it's a constant turning of the work that makes it feel quite time consuming. So there's a way of being able to knit backwards, which means that you don't need to turn the work every time you do a purl row. And I found that since I've taught myself how to do this, I use this loads on all sorts of things, such as when I just need to do a couple of stitches before turning work in short rows, like heel turns on socks or toes. So I've been now use this technique all the time because it saves having to turn the work around every time you're doing backwards and forwards. Knit rows and then purl rows. I wouldn't use it if the rows were large, so if you were doing a, say, cardigan and you're doing the back of the cardigan and you're knitting straight across each time. If the number of stitches is quite large, I'm still quite slightly faster purling my usual way. But for just a couple of stitches, rather than having to stop and turn the work all the time, this is a really great technique. So I'm going to show you how to knit backwards today. So what I have done here is cast on a few stitches and worked a couple of rows in stocking stitch. Throughout this tutorial, I'm going to use the terms active needle and passive needle. The active needle is a needle that's doing the work, on which is where the stitches are going to end up on, and the passive needle is a needle that has all the stitches yet to be worked on. So it doesn't matter if you're left or right-handed. I'm also going to go through the techniques, firstly using the English method, and then also showing Continental style as well. So if you knit either with a yarn in your left or right hands, or English or Continental style, this tutorial will help you with both of those methods. So the yarn's active yarn here. So normally what we would do in this is turn it around and then purl back along this row. What I'm going to do is just purl a couple of stitches to show exactly what happens when we're doing a purl stitch, because what we need to do is all those things but backwards or inverted to be able to knit backwards instead. So when we purl, the active needle goes through the front loop of yarn and in front of the passive needle. The yarn then comes over the top of the active needle and round it, and then that thread of yarn is taken out to the back of the knitting to form the new stitch. So if I do that again, the active needle is at the front of the work going through the front loop of the stitch. The yarn comes between the gap between the two needles and then over and round the active needle, and then that thread of yarn is taken out to the back of the other work, which would be the right side if you're working in stocking stitch. So let's do that again. but show how we can do this as knitting backwards. So this time my active needle is now the needle in my left hand, because this is the one with the stitches already worked, and the passive needle is the one in my right hand because these are the stitches that have yet to be worked. So the active needle in a normal purl stitch will go in front, but in this time it needs to go into the back. So it goes through the back loop of the yarn and behind the passive needle. The yarn then comes over the top and round the active needle. The active needle then pulls that loop of yarn out to the front of the work. Now we have a stitch that's been knitted backwards. So if I go through that slowly again, the active needle, or the yarn so the passive one is the one with the stitch to be knitted on. So the active one goes through the back loop of the stitch and out to the back of the work. The yarn is coming up through the middle and over the top of the active needle. This thread of yarn then needs to come through to the front of the work rather than the back. So we take it through and slip that stitch off. And I'll do that one more time. The active needle goes into the back of the stitch. The yarn comes over the top of the active needle and round, and then that loop of yarn is taken out to the front of the work. And there you go, that's 3 stitches knitted backwards. I'll do one more time and then I'll show you how to do it in Continental style. So the active needle is going to the back leg of the stitch into the back of the passive needle. The yarn comes over the top of that active needle and round it, and then that loop of yarn is brought forwards through the front of the work and we slip the stitch off. So if you work continentally, which is how I do most of my work, because I find purling much faster than I do in the English style, it's a similar process, but obviously the yarn is in the other hand. So when we're doing it this way round, the needle goes again through the front leg of the stitch and in front of the passive needle. The yarn is going over the top and then it's taken out to the back. So I'll show you one more time. Needle goes through to the in front of the legs of the stitch and in front of the passive needle. Yarn goes over the top and then it's taken back out to the back. So we're going to do exactly the same thing but backwards. So if I turn the work around, we're going to do the same. So it starts in the same way, in that the active needle is going out through the back leg of the stitch and to the back of the passive needle. It's going to do exactly the same thing. It's going to come over the top and around that needle and then that loop brought through to the front. Active needle goes to the back leg of the stitch and back of the passive needle. Yarn comes over the top of the active needle and round it. We then take that loop of stitch out through to the front, and I do this by using my passive needle to lift the old stitch over the top of that new one. And you can see that all the stitches are the same way and the row beneath has not been twisted. And there you go, that's how you can knit backwards. What this means for when you work in the entrelac knitting is all these little blocks are actually all knit with the work facing, because this one's knitted around facing forwards, and actually you never need to turn the work. So in these blocks of say 8 stitches, you're going backwards and forwards, but because you knit backwards, you knit those stitches, then you knit the stitches backwards, knit the stitches backwards, and you keep doing that for the whole block without having to turn the work. And this makes it really quite nice and straightforward to do, much less clunky than having to turn around, particularly when you're knitting a whole garment and you've got a big garment on your needles, having to turn a whole big piece of work around just to knit a couple of stitches, to purl a couple of stitches, and makes the whole process much faster, and meant that I really enjoyed knitting this entrelac, because it was just like each little block was really nice to complete. You knew how many blocks you got to do in a round, and you think, right, tonight I might knit 5 blocks, and I just work backwards and forwards for 5 little blocks, and actually completed quite a lot of knitting. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and enjoy a really good yarn-dell if you're joining us from the yarn-dell at home, and I will see you soon. Thank you. Hi, this is Sarah Alderson from Alderson Designs. Thank you for watching my tutorial, and I hope you found it helpful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more new tutorials as they're released, and if you can, click the like button and let me know in the comments how you found knitting backwards. You can also subscribe to my newsletter, and the link is below in the video description, where you'll get exclusive discounts on all my upcoming new pattern releases. Thank you and have a lovely day.